For the first time in the history of archaeological finds in Israel, scientists excavated a fortified Judah city from the time of King David, a discovery that told more about David than had ever been known. "I have to say this before I die," said Dr. Yosef Garfinkel. "King David's kingdom has been buried long enough. Its secrets. The Valley of Elah lies across Israel like an open wound in time, silent hills with secrets that have rested for 3,000 years. This is a mythical battlefield where, by ancient scripture, a youthful shepherd named David and a giant named Goliath battled using a sling and 5 smooth stones. For generations, the location was a site of myth and belief, the stories handed down like sacred traditions. But underground, something remarkable lay hidden. As Dr. Garfinkel's team started digging, they revealed gigantic stone walls out of sand, 2 colossal gates, fragment of pottery inscribed in ancient Hebrew, and idols-free altars. What they found was a 3,000-year-old fortified city corresponding exactly to the period when King David was supposed to have reigned. For centuries, scholars had maintained David was a myth, a figure invented by subsequent scribes to authenticate a mythical kingdom. The united monarchy of David and Solomon, they claimed, was mere religious fiction. But Garfinkel's find turned all of this on its head. At the twilight of a career dedicated to digging up the past, the Hebrew University archaeologist at last conceded what academic politics had long kept him from saying. He had discovered the evidence the world would not believe, proof strong enough to rock the very foundations of history. Born in 1956 in a young and restless Israel, Garfinkel was raised in a land where even the stones had stories to tell. Farmers working in fields would occasionally uncover pottery from a time of prophets, reminders that history wasn't between the covers of books, but literally under their feet. As a professor of archaeology at Hebrew University, Garfinkel spent his life reading the Iron Age, the period between 1200 and 600 BCE, when the kingdoms of the Bible were said to flourish and perish. In 2007, he started digging at a site known as Khirbet Qeiyafa, situate on a rocky outcropping over the Valley of Elah, some 20 miles southwest of Jerusalem. The site lay between the Israelite highlands and the plains of the Philistines. Ancient writings spoke of a city here by the name of Sharaim, Hebrew for 2 gates, and what Garfinkel uncovered would set ablaze one of archaeology's most epic controversies. Carbon dating dated the site at 1020 to 980 BC, precisely the period ascribed to King David's rule, when the Israelite tribes were initially reported to have come under the leadership of a single ruler. The timing in itself was incendiary. For the 1990s and early 2000s, biblical minimalists held sway over Western archaeology, asserting there wasn't any proof of a united Israelite kingdom. David, they said, was a small-time tribal chieftain, and the big kingdom painted in the books of Samuel and Kings was utter fantasy written hundreds of years after the fact as national propaganda. The stunning Temple of Solomon, the political system, the centralized government, all fiction. But Garfinkel's findings painted a different picture. The defenses at Khirbet Qeiyafa were massive, way beyond what a village leader might construct. The walls, made of stones weighing as much as 5 tons each, had sophisticated casemate building. Double walls connected by perpendicularly placed partitions that created chambers for storage and defense. To construct such a structure took thousands of coordinated laborers and central authority. Most strikingly, the city boasted not 1 but 2 gates, Athens architectural luxury. The eastern gate looked toward Jerusalem and the Judean hills. The western gate opened up to Philistine plains. It perfectly matched the biblical name Sharaim, the place of 2 gates. Pottery shards at the site were clearly Judahite, not Philistine or Canaanite. In the city, archaeologists discovered 3 cultic rooms filled with standing stones and offering tables, but no idols, no figurines, no images of gods or goddesses. This lack was breathtaking. Every other contemporary site in the area was filled with cultic imagery. But here, the ancient Israelites' prescription against graven images already seemed to be the norm 3 millennia ago. Next was the most surprising discovery. Within a building close to one of the gates, Garfinkel's team unearthed an ostrakon, a piece of pottery upon which people had written, containing 5 lines of early Hebrew writing. Paleographic study dated it to the 10th century BCE, one of the oldest Hebrew inscriptions ever discovered. Although the writing was incomplete, some of the words were readable in clear script. Judge, slave, king, widow, orphan. The message seemed to address justice, compassion, and protection of the vulnerable, values later repeated throughout the Psalms and prophetic literature. There was concrete evidence of organized government literacy, moral and religious values, all in a city perfectly within the biblical chronology. Garfinkel determined that the proof established David's kingdom, real, centralized, literate, and powerful. Though the biblical texts were obviously theological, they were based on true historical memories. He published his work widely, lectured, and countered the minimalist position directly. But the louder he spoke, the louder came the attacks. The reaction from the academic community was quick and merciless. Critics were quick to dispute the interpretation, attacking the carbon dating techniques and positing contamination or statistical mistakes that could cause the dates to seem older than they were. Some posited that the site could have been Philistine or Canaanite instead of Judahite, alleging the pottery categorizations were subjective and that the lack of idols asserted nothing. The Ostracon was a specific battleground as scholars argued back and forth about whether its script was actually Hebrew, Canaanite, or even Philistine, with others calling it too fragmentary to make any judgments about its content or context. Each word, each letter was argued over. Underlying these scholarly differences, though, were something more profound: charges of bias. Professor Yosef Garfinkel was criticized for taking religious assumptions to the work, for looking for what he wanted to see rather than what appeared to be present. Critics argued that he was conducting biblical archaeology, a term pejoratively used to characterize researchers seeking to validate scripture rather than objective truth. Others muttered that he had nationalist motivations, that his findings were politically motivated to validate contemporary Israeli claims by highlighting past Jewish presence. The academic community became hostile. Meetings became incendiary. Journal articles reeked of disdain, and funding organizations feared that endorsement of his research would be seen as partisan. Garfinkel became increasingly alone. Western universities who had once opened their doors to his ideas now stepped back. The big archaeological institutions avoided him, and museums that could have advertised the Kirby-Kiyafa finds under the auspices of David's kingdom opted for bland, nondescript statements, sandwiched between religious factions hailing the finds and secular archaeologists questioning them. The Israeli Antiquities Authority took conservative middle ground, playing down the Davidic link and with vague wording in releases and signage. Looking back, Garfinkel confessed those years were years of loneliness and rebellion. "I wasn't looking for faith," he said. "I was looking for truth, but truth scared them." In the still evenings when the excavation team went home, he would stroll through the ancient walls, his fingers tracing stone he was certain David's men had set, their weathered faces worn smooth by 3 millennia of wind and rain. Sometimes he worried that his life's work would be labeled controversial and fall into obscurity, buried again under layers of academic politics. But beneath those stones, he found something that would alter his relationship to his work. Inscriptions predating the Bible, stones laid out before the prophet spoke, proof of a kingdom that preceded legend. The more he dug, both literally and metaphorically, the more complicated the picture. The Ostracon was just the start. Year after year, the data mounted, showing a complex urban scheme. Casemate walls serving as storage, dwelling, and administrative space, imposing 6-chambered gates proclaiming power and stability, and an arrangement that implied intentional city planning under central authority. The assemblage of ceramics was remarkably consistent. Comparable forms occurring in the Judean highlands, differentiated from Philistine ceramics in the vicinity, implying a Judahite population deliberately set in disputed land. The cult rooms told even more. Unlike other Near Eastern sites that are cluttered with idols and figurines, Kirby-Kiyafa produced none. 3 shrines held standing stones, altars and offering tables, but not one image of a god. Garfinkel suggested this was evidence of the aniconic tradition, the earliest shewing of graven images, that would later characterize Israelite religion and the 10 Commandments. Critics responded that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, but after decades of digging, the trend persisted. The carbon dating was equally conclusive. Samples of olive pits, grain, and when tested at Oxford consistently fell between 1020 and 980 BC, the very time of David's rule. The results were verified by several independent laboratories. The location of the site in the Valley of Elah, where the Bible sets David and Goliath, provided additional support for the interpretation. Strategically located between the coastal plain and the Judean highlands, the fortress controlled trade routes and military routes, ideally placed as a frontier outpost. Garfinkel's findings were consistent with other discoveries, including Dr. Eilat Mazar's excavation in Jerusalem, city of David, where the same type of pottery and architecture indicated a network system of fortified sites in the Judean highlands. Together, they had portrayed not a legendary empire, but a structured early kingdom, precisely what one might expect if biblical tradition remembered David's reign accurately and recorded historical fact. But as the proof piled up, so did opposition. Scholarly journals posted scornful reactions, conferences grew poisonous, and erstwhile collaborators kept their distance. Archaeology had turned into a battlefield where ideology commonly trumped evidence. Reviewers called for Garfinkel to eliminate references to David from scholarly publications. Critics charged his bestsellers with sensationalism, and secular and religious publics criticized him for not advancing their agendas. They said archaeology shouldn't prove faith, he thought. But when faith leaves evidence, what should we call it? A former skeptic committed to scientific discipline, Garfinkel never intended to prove scripture, merely to shed light on history and material remnants. But the evidence spoke. The stones, pottery, and isotopes all pointed in directions many found uncomfortable for reasons far from archaeology. I started out a skeptic, he said later. I never thought the stones would talk, but once they did, I had to listen. The backlash was unrelenting. At conferences, colleagues assailed him personally. Younger scholars hungry for reputations labeled his interpretations as naive. The most damaging charge was biblical literalism, that he used a trowel in one hand and the Bible in the other. In fact, his techniques were unexceptional. Stratigraphic excavation, careful recording, multidisciplinary analysis, and peer review. His finding, however, gave people the creeps, and unease begot suspicion. Sponsorship dwindled. Religious groups providing support led secular sponsors to fear bias, and universities worried about political fallout in the context of Israeli-Palestinian tensions. Archaeology in Israel was always political. Each stone was heavy. Garfinkel's research turned into ammunition for nationalism, religion, and identity debates. Secular Israelis worried it strengthened religious conservatives. Religious Jews welcomed it as validation. Palestinians viewed it as erasure of their own past, and international critics charged Israeli archaeology with advancing state agendas. Sandwiched between them all, Garfinkel saw his funding disappear and his invitations dwindle. Younger academics shunned his name to safeguard their careers. At times, he wondered whether it was worth it, whether he should have brought out only the reports on the pottery and remained impartial. But impartiality, he came to see, would have been intellectual cowardice.